Destiny does not always announce itself with the thunder of artillery or the cheering of the masses. Sometimes it arrives in the suffocating silence of a winter morning, carried within the folds of a black sealed letter that weighs heavier than any crown. It was February of the year 1785, and Paris was imprisoned in the gray grip of winter. Inside the prestigious École Militaire, the walls were composed of unyielding stone that seemed to radiate a chill designed to harden the souls of the young men who walked its corridors. Among them moved a figure who did not belong to the high aristocracy of France. He was 15 years old. He was slight of build, with a complexion that betrayed the Mediterranean sun of his birth, and eyes that held a gray-blue intensity which unsettled his instructors. This was Napoleon Bonaparte, and he was about to face the first true conquest of his life, not on a battlefield, but within the quiet devastation of his own heart. The news arrived from Montpellier. It traveled slowly across the frozen provinces to reach the capital like a funeral bell, whose resonance deepens with distance. His father, Carlo Buonaparte, had died. The man who had charmed viceroys and gambled with the family fortune had succumbed to a stomach cancer that devoured him from within. For the young cadet standing in the austere light of the military academy, the world did not merely shift, it collapsed. Carlo had been the bridge between their modest Corsican nobility and the grandeur of Versailles. He was the architect of their integration into France and the source of their precarious finances. Now that bridge had crumbled into the dust. The isolation of Napoleon in this moment was total. He was surrounded by the sons of dukes and generals who mocked his accent and his poverty, yet he could show no weakness. In the solitude of his quarters, he confronted the terrifying reality of his new existence. He was no longer merely a student funded by royal scholarship. He was the de facto head of a clan that was spiraling into destitute obscurity. His older brother Joseph was gentle and mild, but he lacked the fire required to salvage a drowning family. The burden therefore bypassed the laws of primogeniture and settled squarely upon the narrow shoulders of the second son. He wrote to his mother, Letizia Remolino, with a maturity that terrified those who read the letters. There were no hysterics and no childish pleas for comfort. Instead, there was a stoic acceptance of a tragedy that demanded immediate action. He offered his sword and his labor to the family cause. At 15, he understood that the carefree days of youth were a luxury he could no longer afford. The death of Carlo stripped away the last illusions of safety. It taught the future emperor that life is a relentless siege where resources are scarce and allies are few. He realized that if he wished to survive, he could not rely on the favor of kings or the luck of his father. He would have to forge his own providence out of iron and will. The boy died in that cold Parisian winter, so that the man could begin to breathe. He stared into the void left by his father and saw only the steep and treacherous path to glory. To understand the weight that crushed the young shoulders of the artillery officer, one must first exhume the ghost of the man who placed it there. Carlo Buonaparte was a creature of tragic contradictions and fatal charm. He was a man who moved through the salons of Ajaccio and the courts of Versailles with the fluid grace of a diplomat, yet he lacked the iron constitution required to survive the sharks of the French aristocracy. He had been a follower of Paoli, the great liberator of Corsica. But when the winds of politics shifted, Carlo bowed to the French conquest with a pragmatism that many whispered was betrayal. He embraced the new regime not out of love for the fleur-de-lis, but out of a desperate hope that assimilation would secure a future for his blossoming brood of children. He wore his nobility like a costume that was slightly too expensive for his purse. He spent years chasing titles and recognitions and proving his lineage to the heralds of arms in Paris so that his sons could enter the royal academies and his daughters could marry into wealth. But this ambition came at a ruinous price. Carlo was a dreamer who speculated on grand agricultural schemes that were doomed to fail. The most infamous of these was the Mulberry Nursery affair, a government contract to grow trees for the silk industry, which promised vast riches but delivered only bureaucratic nightmares and spiraling debt. He borrowed heavily against the family properties and leveraged the dowry of his stoic wife to fund trips to Paris where he would plead his case in velvet coats that he could not afford. When he died, he left behind no coffers filled with gold, but a labyrinth of promissory notes and legal battles that would haunt his second son for years. The legacy of Carlo was not power, but the terrifying fragility of social status. Napoleon observed this with a cold and penetrating judgment that belied his age. He loved his father, but he despised the weakness that Carlo represented. He saw how the pursuit of pleasure and the reliance on the goodwill of others had left the family exposed to the elements. The father had been soft and indulgent and prone to the romantic gestures of the older generation. The son determined in that moment to be hard and exacting and relentlessly solvent. The financial ruin was not merely a matter of numbers in a ledger, it was a visceral humiliation. It meant that while his peers at the academy ordered fine wines and new boots, Napoleon was forced to meticulously calculate the cost of paper and ink. It meant that the Buonaparte name in Corsica was under siege by creditors who saw the widow Letizia as easy prey. The ghost of Carlo hovered over every decision the young officer made. It was a warning etched in fire that talent without discipline is a tragedy, and that ambition without financial independence is merely a form of begging. Napoleon resolved to pay the debts of the father, not to honor his memory, but to erase the shame of his failure. He would scrub the stain of poverty from his name, even if he had to scour it with gunpowder and blood. Back in the sun-scorched hills of Corsica, the burden of the collapse fell upon a woman of Roman fortitude. Letizia Romolino was 35 years old when she became a widow. She was left with 8 children to feed and a house that was besieged by the creditors of her dead husband. She was not a woman given to tears. She was a matriarch carved from the granite of the island itself. While Carlo had been the velvet glove, she was the iron hand. She looked at her brood of future kings and queens and saw only mouths that needed bread and futures that were dangerously uncertain. She managed the dwindling finances with a miserly precision that would later define the logistical genius of the emperor. She cut every expense and sold off the silver and negotiated with the ruthless clarity of a general holding a fortress against a siege. It was from her that Napoleon inherited his terrifying capacity for work and his disdain for luxury. He watched her battle against the indignity of poverty, and he learned that survival requires a hardness of spirit that allows for no sentimentality. In this vacuum of authority, a strange and unnatural shift occurred within the family dynamic. By the ancient laws of tradition, the mantle of leadership should have fallen to Joseph, the eldest son. But Joseph was mild and indecisive and possessed a gentle soul that was ill-suited for the brutal realities of their predicament. He was a man of peace born into a time of war. Napoleon saw this with the predator instinct that was already awakening within him. He did not ask for permission to lead. He simply assumed the weight. He began to dictate the path of the family from his distant barracks. He wrote letters that were not requests but commands. He decided where his siblings would be educated and how the meager funds would be allocated. He became the father to his own older brother. It was a coup d'etat within the domestic sphere. The second son usurped the first not out of malice but out of necessity. Letizia recognized this shift and she allowed it. She saw in the burning eyes of her second son the only weapon sharp enough to cut through the nets of debt and obscurity that trapped them. She stepped back and allowed the wolf cub to guard the pack. In the garrison town of Valence, and later in the damp fogs of Auxonne, the young Lieutenant Bonaparte waged a private war against his own body. He was 16 and 17 years old during these years of the artilleryman's fast. His salary was a pittance, and even that meager sum was not his to keep. The majority of his earnings were sent immediately to Letizia in Corsica to keep the wolves from the door. What remained was barely enough to sustain human life. He lived in a rented room that was little more than a cell, where the furniture consisted of a bed without curtains and a table covered in papers. He ate once a day. He avoided the taverns and the chemis where his fellow officers drank and gambled away their inheritances. To save money for books, he stopped eating butter, and he learned to exist on dry bread and milk. This self-imposed starvation was not merely an act of necessity, it was an act of defiance. Every meal he skipped was a victory over his circumstances. While his stomach growled in the empty silence of his room, his mind was feasting on the empires of the past. He read with a voracious and terrifying appetite. He devoured Plutarch and Polybius and the campaigns of Frederick the Great. He studied the geography of lands he had never seen and the constitutions of nations that had long since crumbled. He was building an archive of knowledge in his mind that was vast and encyclopedic. He understood that knowledge was the only currency that the revolution could not devalue and the only weapon that the aristocracy could not confiscate. But the poverty left its mark. His uniform was often threadbare and his boots were worn at the heels. When he walked through the streets, he did so with a stiff and defensive pride. He could feel the eyes of the wealthy French officers upon him. They saw a scruffy little Corsican with an uncouth accent and a gloomy disposition. They did not see the volcano that was dormant beneath the surface. This social humiliation bred a cold and diamond-hard resentment in his heart. He began to despise the privilege of birth that allowed incompetent men to hold high rank while men of talent starved in garrets. The seeds of the French Revolution found fertile soil in the hungry belly of Napoleon Bonaparte. He spent his nights writing. He wrote essays on suicide and dialogues on the nature of love and glory. He poured his frustration onto parchment by the light of a single tallow candle, which he guarded jealously to save wax. In these long and lonely nights, the future emperor was forged. He learned that solitude is the school of genius. He learned that to rule others, one must first conquer one's own appetites. The hunger sharpened his senses and stripped away the fat of his soul. He became lean and wiry and intense. He was a tightly coiled spring waiting for the hand of history to release him. The fast of the artilleryman was not a period of suffering. It was a period of accumulation. He was gathering the strength to shake the world. The transformation was finally complete, not in the grand halls of a palace, but in the silent fortress of his own mind. By the time the revolution erupted across the cobbled streets of Paris, the young officer had already undergone his own internal revolution. The debt and the grief and the relentless pressure of the family burden had burned away the softness of his youth, leaving behind a core of tempered steel. He no longer looked at the world with the eyes of a boy who wished to be accepted. He looked at it with the gaze of a man who intended to conquer. The poverty that had once shamed him was now his armor. He realized that the aristocrats he despised were weak because they had never known the terror of an empty cupboard or the desperation of an unpaid bill. They were soft men living in hard times while he was a hard man forged for the coming storm. He had learned to calculate the value of everything. He knew the cost of a cannonball and the price of loyalty and the weight of a crown. The chaotic financial management of his father had taught him the supreme importance of order. He became obsessed with details and logistics. He understood that a battle is won not only by courage, but by shoes and bread and ammunition. The visionary emperor, who would one day reorganize the map of Europe, was born in the ledger books of his bankruptcy. He took the chaos of the Buonaparte family and he imposed upon it a structure of iron discipline. He demanded success from his brothers and virtue from his sisters because he knew that they were the only allies he could trust in a hostile world. The death of Carlo was the crucible. If the father had lived, Napoleon might have remained a minor officer in the service of the king content, with a small pension and a quiet life in Ajaccio. But the void left by the father forced the son to expand to fill the empty space. It compelled him to seek a greatness that would silence the creditors and eclipse the memory of their ruin. He walked out of the shadow of the Mulberry Nursery disaster and into the blinding light of history. He carried the weight of his family like a knapsack upon his back, and he did not buckle. He stood now on the precipice of the modern age. The wind of the revolution was beginning to howl, and the old monarchies were trembling in their foundations. Napoleon adjusted his bicorn hat and tightened his grip on his sword. He was ready. He had conquered hunger, and he had conquered shame. The conquest of Europe would be merely a matter of logistics. The boy who wept for his father in the cold dormitory of Paris was gone. In his place stood the emperor in waiting. The burden had not broken him. It had built him. History often remembers the triumphs of the eagle, but it rarely speaks of the hunger that taught it to hunt. The legend of Napoleon Bonaparte was not written in the gold of the Tuileries, but in the copper coins he counted in a dim room in Valence. It was the death of a father and the crushing weight of duty that transformed a Corsican outcast into the master of the world. Grief, it seems, is the most potent fuel for glory. The emperor sleeps now in the quiet of the invalids, but his shadow still lengthens across the centuries. To understand the giant, one must first understand the orphan. If you wish to continue walking the path of history's titans alongside us, subscribe to this channel. Uncover the stories that time has tried to forget. The past is waiting.